Keeper of the Blood Cernd watched as Apothecary Dauntless finished the procedure for securing the progenoid glands in their cryostasis. Dauntless delivered an exacting performance, tracking the readouts and adjusting the dials as necessary to ensure a stable transition. One battle brother falls, and within days the organ would be placed into an eager aspirant. The small hunks of meat were so unassuming, so forgettable, yet they were the key to everything. Between implanting recruits, the ritual, and battlefield collection, Cernd had handled thousands of them in his 700 years. He could not say he was fatigued, but Cernd felt the weight of his experience now as this acolyte of barely 50 years learned the methods of sustaining the chapter, and through it, the Imperium. There was hardly a more crucial duty, and that was before mentioning the resurrection of the Primarch. Presently, Dauntless finished and turned to Cernd, who nodded. No words were needed. They both knew the result. Cernd gestured, and they swept out of the Apothecarium, their gray cloaks denoting their role swishing about them, and headed towards the embarkation decks. As they walked through the halls of the Echo of Blood, there were no other humans, transhumans, or servitors moving about. The only sound outside of their footsteps was a low, haunting chant emitting from every vox grill. It had been so for the past 30 minutes, as every battle brother descending to the surface went to honor the Slayer and voice their oaths to him. Before long, they entered the cavernous hangar. A large force was assembled, most of the chapter, with representatives from each of the wings. The Shadows with their camouflage cloaks and long-barreled weapons. The Spears with their swords, claws, and high-output bolt weapons. And finally, the Eyes with their autocannons cycling and plasma gun coils winking in the half-light. A few heads turned briefly at their entrance, their footsteps echoing in the vast space, but most stayed focused on the Soul Warden. As the pair approached, Tycentus was rising from one knee in front of Sarevok, his oath complete. The new witness, Anomen, stood nearby, the bulky armor worn by all who attained that rank, still shining and glossy, not yet stained by war and blood. Cernd knew this Marine's reputation well, had repaired some of his wounds before, in fact, and guessed the armor would not remain unmarred for long. Soul Warden Tycentus motioned for Cernd to step forward. It was customary for the Keeper of the Blood to give his oath to the Slayer last. All the other oaths were important and had their place, but none mattered as much as a Keeper's. It was their duty to collect the gene seed upon death, and it was taught that a Slayer's trust in the Keeper pushed him to fight harder and penetrate deeper into enemy lines, knowing that they would lead the charge to bring back his progenoid. Cernd looked to Dauntless and motioned with his hand. The Apothecary stiffened and involuntarily looked at the Keeper. Cernd did not move. It was time for the young Marine to earn his title. For until he successfully retrieved the gene seed of a fallen Slayer in the midst of battle, he could not be called a Keeper of the Blood. An Apothecary was never forewarned concerning when they would accompany a strike force. It had never been done in Cernd's memory, and he would not be the one to break tradition. This day seemed fitting, however. Dauntless was ready, and Cernd's own initiation, centuries in the past, had been presided over by the same foe that now waited on the moon below. Dauntless stepped forward, and Sarevok's eyes flashed a bright red and seemed to drill through him, weighing his worth and finding him wanting. The former witness bared his teeth in a snarl, his nearness to the rage clear for all to see. Dauntless slowed his pace, unsure in the face of the mounting ferocity. Guardian Keldorn placed his hand on Sarevok's shoulder, somehow calming him. Even after all this time, Cernd had no idea how the Guardians did it. Cernd made a subtle gesture, and Sarevok turned his attention to him. The eyes dimmed slightly, recognition kindling in the flames of their Primarch's last memories. They seemed to be pleading for Cernd to take the Apothecary's place. They had fought together for over 400 years, and Sarevok trusted no other. The Keeper did not stir, except to nod his head toward Dauntless. The movement sufficed not only for his support, but his oath as well. Sarevok calmed slightly at this, and Keldorn removed his hand, motioning the Apothecary forward. Dauntless got down on one knee, removed his helm, and spoke directly into Sarevok's burning visage. You see what the Primarch sees. You feel what he feels. In this moment, you are the angel. By your deeds, his sons will live to fight on. We will avenge you, Slayer. This I swear in the name of Sanguinius and the Emperor. That is the end of the oath for all except their kind. Dauntless continued, emotion tugging at the words as he uttered them. Mine is the sword that will come for you, though you will never see it. When the enemy finally pierces the glory of your triumph, I will ensure you fight forever." He rose and turned, his task complete. He looked to Cernd, who nodded and moved away towards the exit. Dauntless stayed and readied to make planetfall. As Cernd returned to the Apothecarium in his customary silence, the chanting over the Vox ceased and life returned to the decks. Servitors trundled about their myriad tasks. Human officers carried out preparations to support the ground forces and crush any spaceborne threat. The Keeper prepared his tools and equipment. There were orcs down below and in orbit. There would be casualties. The countdown for the drop began. As always, when sending an apothecary to his first true test, he thought of the past and waited for the wounded to arrive. Apothecary Cernd sat in the drop pod clamped into his harness amidst the silence after the initial launch and before they hit the atmosphere. The pod was full. Slayer Telwyn and Guardian Koza, along with himself and 7 veterans. Slayer Telwyn turned and looked at Cernd, his red eyes threatening in the half-light of the pod, his lightning claws crackling on and off as he barely contained his rage. Koza, ever watchful, kept everything in check with his mere presence. If not for him, Cernd was certain the Slayer would have attempted to kill him already. He was not pleased that a mere apothecary was sent to escort him to the Primarch. One of the veterans across from Cernd, Sergeant Kevin, sent a subtle vox click to him as he wrapped and rewrapped the leather binding on his axe, a reminder that Cernd was not alone and Kevin's veterans would die to ensure his task was done. This duty was unexpected, but not unwelcome. He had known that he would ultimately be sent, though none were ever told when. There was no doubt as to whether or not he was ready, and Astartes never questioned whether they could fight, and retrieving Gene Seed was a relatively simple task. But would he be strong enough to see this through, to cut into the heart of the enemy in the wake of Sanguinius's rage made manifest and fulfill his oath? He stared back into the Slayer's merciless eyes as the explosion of sound from the pod piercing the atmosphere tore through the confined space. The Slayer did not avert his gaze throughout the descent. Cernd felt the pressure lift only as they hit the ground, and their attentions were given to the greenskins. The orcs were numerous, as orcs always were. The battle was a mess. The pod had been swamped almost immediately by a horde of small, lesser orcs that were soon followed by the real thing. Chainsword and bolt pistol buzzing and clattering away, Cernd pushed into the mob with his escort. The Slayer instantly disappeared into the thickest knot of foes he could find, his incoherent battle cries audible, even above the crash of war and his muted vox. Slayers didn't need the vox. The idea of a warrior in such a state issuing or receiving commands was ludicrous. They were a force of nature unleashed. Whenever a Slayer was involved, it meant insertion behind enemy lines. The apothecary could see pressure being put on the edges of the orc formation, if it could be called such, by the Tears. Plasma discharges, explosive bolt rounds, flame weaponry, but they seemed a long way off. He was glad for the veteran escort, and they all easily followed the trail of limbs and carnage left by their lightning claw-wielding brother, now lost somewhere 10,000 years ago in a time of legend. One of the strengths of the Slayers was that they never stopped moving. Pausing to engage a single foe was not their way. They were not a champion sent to duel the opposing commanders. If they met them, then so be it. Cernd had seen the sheer ferocity from a Slayer bring down an otherwise superior enemy. But their main function was to cause as much mayhem as possible before being dragged down, channeling the flaw into something of value to the Imperium. Tactics were not something Scions of the Ninth understood while encased in Sanguinius's memories. That is what made the mission of the Apothecary, and then the Keeper, so dangerous. They were sent where the Slayer was, but were expected to survive. Their presence allowed the Slayer to truly let go, or so the Soul Wardens assured them. As with all battles, the near misses were many. Waves of reinforcing orcs about to overtake them became distracted by another incoming drop pod. Jump pack assault units of the Tears smashed down, retreated, and blasted out again. The Angel's witness, or at least the eye of the Angel, was watching them. Cernd focused. Not all of the Battle Brothers sent to aid them got out. He saw jump packs torn off and Marines cut to pieces by the brutish orcs. What their blades lacked in finesse, they made up for with savagery. He saw a 5-man combat squad instantly overcome by a green tide, even as the leaves of their drop pod hit the dusty ground of the battlefield. He tended as many as he could, and all the while, the veterans fell one by one. Brother Nimble, his power sword shorting out while lodged in a huge orc's torso, was slowed enough for the beast's power claw to cleave off both of his arms. He toppled over, dying as the lesser orcs swarmed over him with their shank knives and snub-nosed pistols. Guardian Koza intervened, finishing the large orc with one swing of his Crozius and batting off the small ones as they dragged Nimble's body back to Cernd. He extracted the gene seed, and they pushed on towards the knot of orcs surrounding their charge. The Slayer came into view, and he was covered in wounds. Missing armor pieces revealed raw and bloody flesh. The talons on one of his claws were broken and deactivated, choked with orc remains. Despite his wounds, he still moved faster than anything Cernd had seen outside the Eldar. The orcs piled in, seemingly oblivious to the danger and appearing to revel in the slaughter. Each vied for the prize of taking the great warrior's head. And take it they did. Cernd had no idea which orc ended Telwyn, but one moment he was fighting, the next he was drowned under a green flood. It was time to move. Guardian Koza called out, seeing as well that the time had come. They renewed their push to the body. A call went out over the Vox. The Slayer was down. Cernd felt odd at that moment, a pressure he was not used to. Every tear on the field was now sworn to get him to the body. He didn't know why or how, but the tenor of the battle changed. In the past, Cernd had always noticed that when a Slayer fell, his rage seemed to dissipate into the other tiers on the battlefield, almost as if each Marine sent a part of his fury to fuel the Slayer, and when he died, it snapped back into them. There was no doubt now as to the outcome of the battle, but the Apothecaries' trial was just beginning. The orcs crowded in thick, and the chain sword bucked in his hand, shedding spent teeth as he cut through the beasts. The press of bodies was claustrophobic now, the reek of the orc's fungal scent and unwashed leathers that passed for clothing, stressing his helm's filters. He was glad the Guardian was at his side, chanting into the din. The Apothecary took wounds, a cut there, a slug into a soft piece of armor there, but nothing mortal. All available fire from the Tears was being concentrated on this point, and the orcs were falling by the dozen. Before he knew it, Telwyn's mangled corpse was before him, Koza screaming in his ear to finish his work. He bent down and began to dig with the reductor on his Narthesium gauntlet, punching through the hardened bone of the black carapace and into the chest cavity. A warning shout came from his left as a huge shadow fell over him. Cernd turned into the blow as the orc's fist slammed into his shoulder plate instead of his head, crumpling the ceramite and knocking the Apothecary off Telwyn's body. The blow had broken his shoulder, and he felt the pain suppressants kick in as he recovered himself. He looked at his unfinished work. The cut had been made, but the precious progenoid gland was open to the air. One false move, one unlucky happenstance, and the fragile organ would be lost forever. Sergeant Kevin, one of the few remaining from Cernd's escort, leapt at the fearsome alien, his power axe biting deep into its side. The orc howled and turned to face Kevin, his first punch going straight through the veteran's storm shield. The Marine reeled back and fell, tumbling over the bodies of dead orcs and tossing the now useless square of metal aside. The orc bounded forward and pounced, preparing to bring his mighty fist down again, this time onto Kevin's head. In that moment, all of Cernd's training flashed through his mind. It was a rare instance of doubt, one that Apothecaries and Keepers alone knew. Koza was fully engaged on the other side, holding half a dozen orcs at bay with sweeps of his Crozius. Cernd's chainsword revved in his hand and the orc's back was to him. He could intervene and save Kevin, but he didn't. And he knew if he did that at the expense of his duty, Kevin would kill him if Koza didn't get to him first. The sounds of battle crashed back around Cernd, and he saw himself move to secure Telwyn's gene seed, the sound of pulverized ceramite and bursting skull bones echoing in his ears. Both Keeper Cernd's bare hand and his gauntleted one were covered in blood as he fought to save a human soldier. One of her legs had been ripped off by an orc, and somehow she had survived a battlefield triage to make it here. Vital fluid oozed from around the coagulating foam as she moaned incoherently through the pain suppressants. A servitor monitored her readout and dispensed a slurry of chemicals as the Keeper wrapped the stump with a more permanent binding. It would have to do for now. He could hear more casualty trolleys squealing down the hall, and he mentally tallied his remaining space, servitors and human medicae. They were stretched thin. This is why we only send one keeper into battle, he thought. The doors flew open, and 2 veterans staggered in, dragging an Astartes between them and a wheeled bed with another human. Cernd passed the human off to his newest recruit, an aspirant recently assigned to him. He took the Marine from them and maneuvered him down onto a stone operating table, scattering tools and supplies. He began his scan of the body, assessing in a glance that the injuries were bad, fatally bad. The armor was blackened all over, and only nubs of a cloak remained around the neck joint. There was a hole the size of 2 of his fists through the torso, with cracks radiating out from it. Emperor knew what kind of weapon it was. He had seen as many types of armament as he had seen orc warbands, but by the scoring and burn damage, he thought it was plasma or powerful electricity-based discharge. The internal cauterization was the only reason the Marine had made it this far. Then his head jerked as he looked down at what remained of the left arm, a Narthesium gauntlet, or at least half of one. It was Dauntless. Cernd tried to remove the helmet so he could hook the Apothecary up to an artificial lung, but it was stuck. His cutting saw began to whir as he prepared to dig through the ceramite. Judging from the angle and size of the hole in his chest, the patient was being sustained by less than 1 lung and no primary heart. Blood loss was catastrophic from a multitude of other wounds. The helmet came away, along with most of Dauntless's face. The internal mechanisms had fused to and melted his skin. As Cernd looked down into the mess of meat, he knew the rest of the smoking armor was probably doing the same. Cernd heard the door burst open again as more casualties were delivered. He did what he could as Dauntless clung to life, the younger Marine whispering his hypno-conditioned litanies, praising the Emperor and calling for strength from the angel. But this battle could not be won. Cernd was sure of the outcome, but decided to try and give Dauntless his due. He grasped the ruined Narthesium gauntlet, working his fingers through the ash and destroyed casing to the progenoid storage unit. There was 1 gland within. Cernd turned to one of the veterans who was watching him work. Almost like an honor guard, he thought, and gave him a questioning look. The man nodded. As neatly as he could, Cernd tore the component out and transferred the precious progenoid to his own gauntlet for future processing. Then he leaned over Dauntless, gray eyes hard but not without care. "Send us the Primarch, Keeper," and gave him the Emperor's piece.